Well, today we're going to talk about beyond childhood, college careers and relationships. And the important thing we want to emphasize is that for all of the folks we're talking about, we should be thinking about post-secondary opportunities in education, and we should be thinking about the understanding that everybody can work and that there's a way for everybody to have a job. And there shouldn't be an excuse for a person not to be able to have some of those opportunities in the community. So disclosure statement, we have no relevant financial relationships or anything to do with this project. And we're going to be discussing actually evidence-based practices, so we're not talking about anything that's unapproved or a commercial product. And these are things that we're talking about today are not involving clinical medicine, and we are talking about evidence-based practice. So again, today we're going to learn about opportunities for college and careers for folks. We're going to learn about steps necessary for successful transitions to college and careers, and we'll learn about some community-based resources to assist with transition. So recapping, last week we heard about self-determination, and the important takeaway is that self-determination isn't just one thing. It really is a framework around which a series of skills that people need to have to be able to make choices, to be successful in self-advocating, and that as with everybody who's emerging to adulthood with or without a disability, there are all sorts of additional training and skills that need to occur, and soft skills in the college or workplace that a person may need to have. So real quick, this was the skills we had last week regarding self-determination. We're going to talk now real specifically about how these skills impact transition. So choice making, these are skills that people need to practice every day in order for them to be successful in either a post-secondary opportunity or in a workplace. Like we said last week, if a person has not practiced these skills and suddenly gets a job at a grocery store and has to stock a shelf and things don't fit the right way, and that's the biggest problem they've ever faced to solve in their entire life, they're not going to be successful at the job. So these are all skills people need to start practicing young and early and as often as possible. One is choice making, choosing what you want to wear, what you want to eat, what you want to do for your leisure activities, and eventually what you want to do for your job and careers. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Decision making, deciding to wear clothes appropriate for work, school, or weather, deciding what activities you want to do, deciding what job or education goal you're going to pursue. One of the pieces of self-determination research shows that when people actually have a role in choosing the goal they're working on, they do a lot better at working on that goal. So if a person, any person, chooses that this is going to be my goal to lose weight or to go to school, they're going to be more invested in it than if somebody's making them do it. And one thing we have to remember about our young adults with autism and intellectual disabilities is that they're adults, and that at a certain point we need to transition into them choosing their own goals instead of making them do this homework or making them do these types of activities. Problem solving, people need practice problem solving every day so minor problems don't become major obstacles. They need to learn how to have a plan B, how to be flexible, which is especially a challenge for some of our folks with autism. And also people need to be allowed to fail. So, you know, you learn, everybody learns a lot as much from failure as from success. And sometimes we protect our kids with intellectual disabilities too much, and we don't allow them to experience the natural consequences of failure. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that too later. Goal setting and attainment, choosing, deciding, and then problem solving to choose and set your own goals. That's incredibly important. There's something called the self-determined model of instruction, which is out there, and we'll get you some resources on that as an evidence-based practice about how people with intellectual disabilities can learn to choose and set their own goals. Self-management, now we're really getting into some skills that are incredibly important for the workplace. Managing your time using technology, not being prompt dependent. You know, if a person is dependent on cues from paraprofessionals or teachers or job coaches, and that's not faded, or those opportunities to problem solve aren't presented, and a person remains prompt dependent, they're not ultimately realistically going to be successful in a workplace. Self-advocacy, having people understand how to advocate appropriately and effective for both yourself and for accommodations and within relationships. Self-awareness, understanding that your actions impact upon others. One of the pieces of emerging into the adult world for everybody is understanding that if I have a job to do as part of a team and I don't do my job, then it affects everybody else. And that's a huge piece of understanding and awareness that it takes time for all kids to develop. And there are ways we can teach our kids with intellectual disabilities to have that understanding as well. And finally, self-knowledge, having enough opportunities to practice all of the above so you can lead a self-determined life. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is that we know people are happier with or without disabilities if they're doing what they want to do, and they're making choices every day to deciding how they want to live their life. We know that people who are in situations that are in institutional settings or in situations where they're have tightly controlled lives, that people are not as happy, that people have more behaviors, that people are not as successful. And so we want people to have this ability to lead a self-determined life.
So one of the options for individuals with disabilities that has grown in the past several years are university programs. There's several different opportunities for them. There's the traditional option of going and getting a bachelor's degree at the campus or online. They could go through a community college or a regular university. There's new certificate programs that are usually called TPSIDs, which are trans post-secondary education. Intellectual disabilities. Secondary programs for individuals with disabilities, intellectual disabilities. So those are 2-year programs where they can go and have the opportunity to be on campus, see what campus life is, while also working there. They may take a credit class or two, they live on campus, they really emerge in there, while they're also working on employment opportunities and those skills that we had just discussed. And then there's the degreed opportunities. And then community college are also another opportunity. You can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. Why a lot of people choose the community colleges over universities? They're smaller campuses. They can navigate a little bit easier. Sometimes it's a smaller ratio of students to professors, so they really get to know the professor, and the professor gets to know them and understands their disability and how best to help them and support them in the classroom. It's lower cost, and then the flexibility in setting a schedule as well. They can take a lighter load. They may start with 1 or 2 classes versus having to go in the university taking 4 to 5 and being full-time. So those are some opportunities for students.
One of the really important things to emphasize for our students with autism, for instance, who do want to be degree-seeking college students, is I can't tell you the number of families I've talked to where we go to K-State or KU and we take a full 15-hour schedule and we fail in the first semester. And we really recommend starting at a community college level and taking those 1 or 2 classes to acclimate to what college life is like, because it's very different than high school. We'll talk about that a little later. But that's really is a road to set people up for success.
Wait, go on. And the other thing that I would say is be familiar with some of the college opportunities that are outside of Kansas. There's a college in Colorado that specifically has a program set up for individuals with autism. And so they transition into that program. They have the supports built in that you need for individuals with autism. They understand the characteristics of autism, and they work closely to help support that individual with autism as they pursue their goal, right? And so there are colleges around the country that are starting to develop specialized programs to be able to help support folks with autism in particular, but IDD in general. Yeah. I'll try to find the actual name of that college.
Or do we have a list already of colleges?
Mm.
that have things set up?
I just know the two that are in Arkansas.
Yeah.
We'll send that out then.
The thing to emphasize though is that regardless of the specialized programs or those community colleges, our community colleges in the state of Kansas are set up to be responsive to the needs of their community. And I know they're all taking steps to be more inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities and people with autism. And really that's one of the purposes they serve, is to be that hub for young adults who are seeking that information. So it may not be for everybody, but that's one place anybody can start from a cost standpoint.
And wait, before you go on, the one other thing is, and for those of you in rural Kansas, looking around to see if you have your community college would be open to setting up a program like what we have at Johnson County Community College, where we actually have a very, very active student group who are individuals that have autism. And so and it was started by an individual with autism, and over time it's morphed so that program is there so incoming students have something they can transition into. Do you want to say a little bit more about what you do? Okay.
So let's talk about some first steps as people are entering high school, as our students are entering high school, and we're really wanting to look at what needs to happen during the transition process, those pre-employment assessments, and some strength and support needs identification. So from an IEP standpoint, we know that that transition officially begins at 14. All of these self-determination skills we've talked about really can be worked out much earlier than age 14. But officially it begins at 14. It requires the full IEP team, and everybody's IEP starting at 14 has a transition page, and it's supposed to describe the post-secondary goals for that student, including what employment they may be seeking, what living situation they're going to be in, and if they're interested in college, what that needs to look like. So that all needs to be on the IEP. One of the challenges that we've seen, Kansas is not very successful in doing good transition IEPs for our kids, because a lot of times those transition statements are very short or just one or two sentences when they should involve a lot more of a detailed statement about what a person is seeking, and it should change every year as a person grows and explores throughout that high school career. And then finally, those transition statements need to be tied directly to the IEP goals. So if my goal is to attend a community college, then I need to have IEP goals that are directly related, that are going to help me be successful in doing that when I graduate. So the other piece with IEPs and transition, if a person is looking at college or that post-secondary piece, there are some preparations that need to be done before that final IEP. First of all, access services, which are the folks at colleges that determine accommodations, really use that student's IEP to determine what accommodations they're eligible for. The type of accommodations available at college are very different than what's available at high school. They're usually much less, and that's a whole other presentation. But the bottom line is it's really important to make sure that every accommodation that student has is listed on that final IEP. Sometimes we have students that have been at the same school district for their entire school career, and you start talking to the IEP team and you say, what do you actually do to accommodate this student? There's nothing on the accommodations page of significance on the IEP, but then say, oh, we just know him, so we always make sure this happens or this happens. Those minor things that everybody's doing for the student need to be listed on that IEP. Usually school districts are really happy to do that on the final IEP because they're not going to serve that student the next year, so they're not being held accountable, even though they should be, to that. So it's very important to make sure all of those accommodations are listed. All of those informal accommodations, oh, we always let him be 5 minutes late to class because we know he's just moved slow through the hall. Well, being 5 minutes late to class at community college isn't going to be acceptable. So we got to list that accommodation. We got to list figuring out how to help him not do that in his final year of school, however that's going to work. The other thing is FERPA. Colleges have to interact with the student and are not required to meet with the student and parent. And in fact, most colleges will not meet with just a parent. And they usually have the student sign a waiver if the parent is going to be in the room with the student discussing, because under FERPA, those grades and those accommodations are private for that student. So one of the frustrations some families have is their student goes to community college, they know they're struggling, they make a phone call to the access counselor and they say, well, I can't talk to you because I have to have the student present. And so it's really important. This is where self-advocacy comes in, because that student is going to have to advocate for themselves. And this is where being prepared to know that you're going to have to be involved in a different way with your child is really important. Yeah.
Release the information, or is that like frowned upon because we're trying to be very,
Well,
that's self-advocacy?
Well, there'll be a release, but again, some access services departments really emphasize having the student present for all of those conversations.
Right. Okay.
And I would encourage that as well. Likewise, this is where self-advocacy comes in, because even if you have accommodations from access services, that student is the one who a lot of times has to be asking for accommodations in different classes. People really will not arrange that in advance for the student in a lot of cases. And so that student really does have to have that self-awareness and that self-advocacy practice. Sometimes it is rote practice on asking for accommodations when you're in those settings. So the other piece to talk about, we know that post-secondary should be a realistic goal for a lot of kids. Employment should be a goal for every student. One of the frustrations that folks have is a lot of times you look at a transition plan and the transition statement says, I'm going to be in a sheltered workshop. And Kansas, 5 years ago, determined it was going to be an employment first state, and has done a lot of work policy-wise, et cetera, to set things up so that that is not going to be an option for students moving forward. Likewise, due to different changes in federal rules, sheltered workshops are being phased out, and in the next 5 years, they're not going to exist the same way they are right now. So the idea that students with intellectual disabilities are simply going to move from school to the sheltered workshop down the road really needs to go away, and we need to start talking about that everybody can work, everybody can be employed. So what can we do to do those pre-employment assessments and figure out what those student interests is? So some of the pieces of that is, one is discovery, and there's an entire set of literature devoted to discovery and employment. There's a fantastic book by Temple Grandin and Kate Duffy that's about discovery and employment, and I urge you to look that up on Amazon. It's well worth owning because it really is the Bible for doing discovery. And what discovery means is that we're going to have the student experience a lot of different employment settings and a lot of different jobs, and do practice and explore all of these things that maybe haven't been exposed to. When you ask a student who's 15 years old, who hasn't been in the community a lot, say, what kind of job do you want? A typical response might be, well, I want to work at McDonald's. Well, that's because McDonald's is where they go every week. They haven't been to all of these other places and all of these other opportunities to be included in workplaces and see what types of jobs are available. So it's important to give them those kind of experiences everywhere. This then it also is going to mean goal setting, which means when I figure out what that student may be interested in or what they may be good at, helping set those transition goals around that. An example, I didn't mention I'm the parent of an 18-year-old with autism. My son loves Disney, Pixar, including Cars, and loves the RVs and cars. So one of the job explorations we set up with his job coach was going to an RV dealer where they detail the RVs, and he loves being around the RVs. He can't do that till he's 18, but this summer he will be. So we may be exploring that for a summer job for him because he's incredibly motivated to be around the RVs because of the Disney Pixar stuff. So finding those special interests, especially our kids with autism, bring to the table, and finding out what about those can be built into some sort of job. And getting creative and delving into that, a lot of times you can really figure those things out. But it's very important then, if we know the direction a student might be heading for transition, is to set IEP goals that help bolster those skills or set them up to be successful in those skills. There's also a Charting the Life course, which you've heard us mention a couple times. Stephanie, will do a brief description of Charting the Life course.
Charting the Life course is a framework where they believe that all people deserve to live. Oh,
We did. I
sorry.
think we have some.
To live, love, and work within their community. So they take that framework and help, and it's across all life stages from very little on up to adults. And using that to goal set, they have some tools that can be used to say, what do we want? And then the unique piece of that one tool, the trajectory tool, is they ask individuals, what don't they want? That's the one thing that we never really do, is talk about what don't they want in life. We always just talk about what they do want in life. So some of those tools are really helpful to set those goals and looking, and then and going backwards from there.
And so some other pieces on strength and support needs identification is another topic that's a presentation in itself. Some really quick tools that are out there that I think people need to be aware of. One is the ARC self-determination scale. We can send that out. And that's just a really brief assessment that measures really whether people are acting in a self-determined manner throughout their life right now, which, I often get to make the meals that I choose. I get to go shopping and buy the things that I want. All of those questions. And what that is it's a great conversation starter for families to talk about. If you have a 14-year-old and you're starting down this transition journey, okay, let's see where that child is functioning in terms of doing these activities they could be doing on their own, and explore ways to build those into IEP goals and into home goals so they can become more self-determined. An example, let's say the child brings a lunch to school every day. Does that child make their own lunch, or does a parent make it for them? What would be a reason why that child wouldn't be making their own lunch every day? So let's figure out how to work that IEP goal in. A good example, I've worked with young adults who are in the workplace and they still live at home, and their parent makes their lunch for them every day. They go into the break room and people are talking about what they're eating and what they brought and how come they brought this or how come they brought that. Well, if your mom packs your lunch, you're removed from the conversation and you're not where everybody else is in that workplace. So all sorts of things that you can look at about sometimes, and I know as a parent of a kiddo with IDD and autism, I do it myself. There are things that I don't let my child do because I think, oh, he will not be able to do that. And it turns out when I free my mind a little bit and I'm ready to accept some failure a couple times, that he actually can do it. And those are things that we need to, that self-determination scale helps us build in. There's something that's called the sports intensity scale. And that is a very detailed scale that looks at what kind of supports a person specifically needs to be successful in their life. So it's used in some states to determine the number of hours of support people receive through their waiver programs. But it's also a wonderful tool that families can use to really look at realistically where do we need to build supports around this child, and where could they be using natural and other supports. The big one that we're mostly going to encounter is the IDD waiver eligibility and assessment tool used in Kansas, which is the BASIS. Online, who's heard of the BASIS or worked with the BASIS at all? Yeah, and so this is the eligibility tool for the IDD waiver for CDDOs. It's 30 years old. It needs to be replaced, and everybody knows that. And it doesn't do a very good job of matching support needs to that person. And one of the hardest parts about that basis is it's not strength-based, it's deficit-based. And so as you start looking at getting into that IDD waiver, one of the things you're going to encounter is they're going to be talking about what are all of the things wrong with that child, what are the things they can't do, cross the street by themselves, use the bathroom by themselves, all of those kind of things. And it's something to keep in mind, that is a means to an end to achieve the right kind of hours and the right kind of support if you're on the IDD waiver. And we'll talk about that if people have questions.
How many of those online work with folks that are already receiving IDD waiver services?
Raise hand.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not seeing anything in the chat box.
Do they
Okay.
know about
Yeah,
Well,
do
we're
you
going to talk
guys
about that
even
in a
know?
second.
Right, but do you guys even know about the IDD waiver?
Just want to type yes or not or, yeah.
Huh.
Okay.
Mhm.
So it might be something good to continue
I
to
know.
Yeah,
introduce.
That's a whole
yes.
thing in itself.
That is a whole thing in and of itself.
So one of the biggest questions when we talk about transition is we know we have a student that's going to need support to be independent in the community. We know that we have a student that's going to need job coaching. We know we have a student that's going to need some level of support. Where does that come from? So the hard answer is that sometimes if people are not eligible for certain things, there isn't a lot of support out there. And that's where we have to start looking at some other natural supports. So we're gonna talk through all of that. The two big pieces of state-supported resources are vocational rehabilitation, which is really important and underutilized, and waiver programs. So vocational rehabilitation is what every person with a disability, whether you have an intellectual disability or you are a soldier who's returning from overseas and have been injured, everybody with a disability goes through vocational rehabilitation to help obtain a job. And so what they do is they do skills inventory, psychological assessment, job coaching, and can be a part of that child's IEP team. So some of the benefits that people often aren't aware that vocational rehabilitation provides, they can, if a child has a qualifying disability, which the kids we're talking about usually do, they can pay for certificate or degree programs for kids with disabilities. So if a student is really into computers, then they need to get an IT certificate to realistically be employed. Voc Rehab can pay for them to obtain that IT certificate. I work with a young man who loved animals, and VR paid for him to get a veterinary assistant certificate, which apparently if you want to work at a vet in a real job, you pretty much have to have these days for insurance purposes. They can pay for work clothes. So if a student is in poverty and doesn't have money to pay for an interview suit or pay for uniform, things like that, it can pay for that. They can pay for books. They can pay for transportation to enable somebody to be able to work. They also, very importantly, when a person pay for job development, including job coaches to actually help a person in the first few months of work, interview skills and resume building. They will pay for all of those things for a person who's qualified for VR services. And so a lot of times people do not access this. There are reasons why that happens. One reason is that there's a lot of red tape surrounding accessing VR. Two is that sometimes VR is a lot like a lot of other programs we have, which does require a significant amount of advocacy on the part of that caregiver to get them to work to do what actually is in the regulation for them to do. So they don't, unlike a lot of services, when you go to VR, they don't advertise sometimes the way they should, that, hey, we could pay for that certification, we could pay for that transportation, we could pay for that work clothes. So it's important to understand that I need to be asking for these things from VR. And if they're telling me I can't do that, to get in writing why they can't do that. Because a lot of times at that point, maybe some things start happening.
So I want to jump in here and give you just an example of the Voc Rehab. I've been working with a young man. He's 18. He had an IEP the whole time. He was a preemie at birth, severe ADHD, had a difficult time in school, and he's been on an IEP since he entered school. He graduated from high school and still experienced challenges and difficulties. And so I started looking around trying to find resources for this young man and stumbled upon, by accident, Voc Rehab. And so when we set up that initial appointment and took him in to Voc Rehab, the thing that the Voc Rehab counselor said to me was, he should have been in here when he was 14. Because apparently, for any child in Kansas that has an IEP at age 14, when they're talking about these transition services, they should immediately get in touch with Voc Rehab. because they can start this whole job training piece while they're working on the IEP.
That service through Voc Rehab is called pre-employment training services. It's new in the past 2 to 3 years. It was part of the WIOA Act.
Yeah, and so what happened when I took this young man in there, found out that he should have, being on an IEP in school is a qualifying condition, right? That you've identified something that is inhibiting their ability to be successful independently. And so they got him set up with and would have paid for a certification program to be an EMT. They would have bought him his work clothes, any books or extra equipment that he would need in order to be successful at doing that. They would have, talked about the difference between an individual that can do that independently, they just need that support behind the scenes, or people that need extra support. And so they were looking at placements to be able to help with extra support. They have the capability of helping the individual find living arrangements, right? And they have connections with places that have independent living facilities, as well as those that are supported living facilities. The other thing is that they will pay for all of his medical conditions that he needs, so his appointments that he needs to make sure that he continues to qualify for Voc Rehab. And then the last thing is that as he's doing supported employment or supported academics, whatever path that he's going to choose to do, they'll pay for, like Sean was saying, that transportation. And so they were even willing to drive 30 miles each way to pick this child up in order to be able to, or this young adult, I guess I should say, in order to transport him back to where he would be able to go to work and then drive him home again. They will also pay for, if the individual doesn't drive, they will pay for, and they live outside that range where they'll send a taxi to pick them up, they'll pay for somebody to transport them. And so there's a lot of back-end supports that are available that people just don't know about. And I think this is one of the biggest ones that I'd like to advocate for and become a common household name in Kansas.
The other thing that's important with VR is that VR is not something that you can only access if your behavior is a certain way or if your disability is a certain level. They cannot discriminate against a person based on manifestations of their disability. It's really important for kids with autism. Sometimes they're in that initial VR interview or VR session and they're not saying appropriate things or they're having some behaviors. Those are things we'll talk about later that VR needs to be able to work with, that you can't say a child isn't eligible for VR because of this particular manifestation of disability, which sometimes does happen. So it's important to advocate that all kids can access VR.
How old do you?
It's any age.
99 plus.
Yeah. So an example, a 35-year-old soldier comes back from Afghanistan and has been injured and is having trouble getting a job. They go to VR, they work with them on finding a job and getting accommodations, those kind of things.
Yeah.
Or paying for that certificate.
And it's across disabilities, so it's not intellectual or developmental disability specific. It's physical disabilities, people with spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injury. Like Sean said, people returning from areas of conflict. It's people that have mental health conditions that they will help folks be able to access treatment for that and then get support and employment. They were very clear with me when I accessed that service that it's a range. They can either help for those people that are more significantly impacted, like in terms of intellectual and developmental disability, by providing supported employment. But then they also have individuals that accessing their services that are getting their PhDs, right? So it's a range of services that is specifically designed to help support individuals to be able to reach their employment goals. Yeah, it is.
So the other piece is, other than VR, is as home and community-based service waivers. And waivers are really what give people access to long-term care services. And so for people with intellectual disabilities, there's the IDD waiver. That's the CDDO system and some of those day and residential supports. There are other waivers in Kansas. So really specifically the waivers that impact employment, which is what we're talking about, and career. One is the IDD waiver, the physical disability waiver, and the TBI waiver. The physical disability waiver is for people with physical disabilities age 16 plus. The TBI waiver, just this last month, they expanded below age 16, so that it'll include kids starting at age 5, including ABA and behavioral therapy services. And we're waiting to see what the regs look like in terms of the other services available through that, but that's a really new thing in terms of what that TBI waiver looks like. There are some other waivers in Kansas that don't really impact employment, but it's important to know they exist. So on the IDD waiver, the services that are available that affect employment, and there are more than just these services available, one is day supports, which is those, not just those day services like a sheltered workshop, but also supported employment. People can receive personal care attendance or personal assistant services. So if I'm qualified for the IDD waiver and I decide that I don't want to go to a workshop every day, I don't want to go to a setting, I can get a personal assistant that will work with me those same number of hours during the day. They provide residential support, so those group homes or those personal assistant services that a person can need to use to live independently, and then supported employment. And then when kids still live at home with their family, supportive home care. The trick with the IDD waiver is that there is a 7 to 9 year waiting list, which means that if I'm eligible for the IDD waiver, I still have to wait 7 to 9 years until I actually receive services. So if a child, you can start being eligible at age 5. So a best case scenario, if I'm on the wait list, maybe at age 12 or 13, I would get that supportive home care. And that would then help me as I transitioned. If a child doesn't get on the waiver till their transition age, like age 15, then they are going to wait till they're age 22, 25, 26 before they're going to have access to some of these, which means that I'm graduating to my living room. So one of the most important messages about that waiver is that if a person has an intellectual disability, and it's even close to qualifying, they need to contact their CDDO and they need to be able to go do that basis and see if they're eligible. I'm going to skip that.
Sean,
So one of the
I'm sorry to
important
interrupt.
pieces to talk about, again, I mentioned this at first, is that Kansas is an employment first state, which means that if a person has an intellectual or developmental disability, we're not saying to them that you can't work, or that we're not going to find excuses or reasons why they can't be a part of the community or can't work. We are going to look for ways that they can be successful, set them up for success, and help them become competitively employed, or do that post-secondary education. This old standby of shelter workshops and piece rate work are being phased out. So folks that think they're going to the shelter workshop down the road, that's not going to be the case 5 years from now. Every single person who's in a sheltered workshop is eligible for VR. Every single person who is doing piece rate work would be eligible for VR to work with them and assist them in finding that employment. The other piece is that don't discount the importance of that post-secondary opportunity. Even if a student probably isn't going to be degree seeking, those college programs that we talked about earlier that do certificates or that allow people to be on campus for a couple of years around kids their own age can do all sorts of things to help that child grow in their soft skills, grow in their ability to be a part of that kind of environment, which can lead to better employment outcomes, and it can lead to greater independence. So one example, Kansas has several sites for what's called Project Search. That's a nationally recognized program that helps people with developmental disabilities do internships in different companies. An example is in Johnson County, they use Johnson County government, which is a pretty extensive operation, to serve as internships for people with IDD. And so you spend a year doing an internship like anybody else does who's looking for a career, and it exposes you to being a part of a workplace and eventually, hopefully, leads to you being employed. There are other project searches that are embedded with hospitals so that people can do internships in the number of jobs that are in that healthcare field or in that hospital. There are numerous examples. I know Salina and Johnson County have them, and Lawrence have them in Kansas. I think there may be a couple other sites. The other community resource to really look at, we talked about earlier how sometimes some of our students, we think, well, they're not going to be ready for a job or ready for post-secondary because of the behaviors that they have. And it's really important to recognize that there are evidence-based practices that can be used to not just assess behavior, but also help mitigate that and have supports put in place.
I have Christine from Lenexa. She is with Sunflower. She did want to just make an exception, just to update regarding there is a crisis exception specifically for someone who has successfully completed the VR process and is placed in a job, and that they can then bypass the 5 to 7 year wait list.
Yes.
So just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that.
Yeah, that's excellent. There's also a crisis exception for family crisis. If a child's going to be homeless or subjected to institutionalization, then they will bypass the waiting list as well. So if you have a student that's in poverty and is graduating to homelessness and they're eligible for the waiver, they would be able to skip all of that waiting list and be served immediately. And so those things do exist. They get increasingly complicated as you start talking about the processes for those.
Which is why it's important to start early.
Yes. So the other piece of behavioral assessment, as Linda's going to talk about what that looks like.
Briefly.
Yeah.
So a lot of what Sean's talked about up until this point has been supports that are state sponsored. So it's funds or supports that are available because of state programs that are in place. There are some kids that have additional needs that you need to look for other options that are not really state sponsored at this point, unless they access one of the waiver programs. And one of the things especially for those kids that continue to display high rates of behavior that is problematic, and that would continue to be problematic and could potentially prevent them from being gainfully employed, would be the option of locating somebody with the expertise in behavior, such as a BCBA, to be able to help conduct what's called an FBA, or functional behavior assessment. One of the things that we do as BCBAs is we look to see what purpose that behavior is serving for that consumer in the environment. Why are they doing it? I just did a presentation last night and I really liked it. If you think of a tree, behavior is the thing you see from the ground up. But there's a whole nother support system that's underground that you don't see. And you have to have a good root system, a good foundation system in order for that tree to grow and thrive. And so it's our job as behavior analysts to understand what's going on with that support system or the skills that that person has or does not have that is preventing them from being as independent and successful as possible because they're engaging in high rates of problem behavior. And so when you do an FBA, what you do is you identify function or purpose. And then the other part that sometimes people often forget is you have to identify those replacement behaviors and you have to actively teach them how to do that instead, right? And so an FBA would identify the function, identify the replacement behavior, and develop a plan to be able to teach them. There's a provider list out there. If you go to the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, you can find a list of BCBAs that are available for practice and hire in the state of Kansas. And I just heard this weekend, and like Sean was saying earlier, currently BCBAs are recognized as providers for autism services under the autism waiver and under EPSDT for that consultative and clinical therapeutic services, the CCTS or autism specialist category. But I heard this weekend that BCBAs in Kansas are also going to be an approved provider under the new TBI waiver, especially for those little kids that are younger too, right? So, so it looks like funding is starting to expand for that BCBA credential, and that would be another avenue to explore when you have consumers that have behavior that's problematic. And as with everything else, start early, right? So if the sooner we can identify these and the sooner we can get a good plan put in place, the more successful our consumers are going to be.